All right, everybody, we're going to get started with our first panel of the day. Welcome to the 33rd Annual Animal Law Conference. My name is Chris Green. I'm the Executive Director of the Animal Legal Defense Fund, and I'm very pleased to be moderating this opening panel, The Role of Media in Animal Advocacy. Before we get started, I'd like to give special thank you to our presenting sponsor, Carroll House Furniture, and thank you also to the Stray Dog Institute, as well as Kat Koshton and Patrick Cleary for your generous support of this conference. It would not be possible without you, so a round of applause for our sponsors. And the Animal Law Conference has been approved for 10 credits of CLE by the MCLE Board of the Supreme Court of Illinois. We call it Thrillinois. Illinois attorneys seeking CLE credits will be contacted by email after the conference with instructions how to secure those. So thank you. So this panel will explore the role of media and journalism in covering animal protection, informing public understanding of animal legal issues, from navigating editorial constraints to amplifying underreported stories. Our panelists will discuss the challenges and ethical considerations in reporting on animals and the impact it has on our collective advocacy. We have a panel of accomplished experts who are also some of my favorite colleagues in the field, so it's my honor and pleasure to introduce them to you now. To my immediate right, we have Anna Bradley, who is the Executive Director of Sentient Media, and it's the only nonprofit, nonpartisan news organization focused solely on factory farms and their effects on climate, animals, workers, clean water, public health, and rural communities. Anna has led Sentient since 2020 and has over a decade of experience designing, producing, and distributing large-scale digital media campaigns. Round of applause. Kenny Torrella is a senior reporter for Vox's Future Perfect section with a focus on animal welfare and the future of meat. He also co-writes Processing Meat, Vox's biweekly newsletter, exploring how the meat and dairy industries shape our politics, culture, environment, and more. Prior to joining Vox, Kenny worked directly in the animal protection sphere for both Mercy for Animals and the Humane Society of the United States, and we actually worked together on some Question 3 ballot initiative stuff. To his right is technically, I guess, his boss in a way. Marina Bolotnikova is the deputy editor of Vox's Future Perfect section, and that covers the world's big moral and technological problems, from things like global poverty, into inequality, to pandemics and factory farming. She also co-writes Processing Meat with Kenny and is an award-winning journalist in her own right who has written groundbreaking work on ventilator shutdown and some of the open rescue trials for outlets such as a place called the New York Times, I think it's called, The Guardian, Intercept, and more. And then to her right is Dutkiewicz. He's an assistant professor at the Pratt Institute whose work focuses on the politics of food, writing both in the popular media and the academic realm. He's a contributing editor at the New Republic and a contributing editor at Vox as well, so Vox is very represented today. Jan is a co-author with Gabriel Rosenberg of a forthcoming book called Feed the People, and we were together at Harvard for a while, and he was easily the most prolific fellow we ever had in our time at Harvard, so round of applause for our speakers. So I'd like, if we could start, just give a kind of brief overview of your path and your story and kind of related to advocacy and journalism.
Yeah, I think like the question of advocacy and journalism is something that I spend so much time thinking about, and I'm sure the rest of our panelists do as well, and we've spoken about it at length. I've been leading Sentient for 6 years now, and as Chris said, we are America's only newsroom that solely focuses on these issues from a nonprofit, nonpartisan point of view. And our journey over these last 6 years has been pretty wild. We were like 2 people with a really, really tiny shoestring budget. Now we're 18 plus, we're still hiring. That's 18 people solely dedicated to reporting on these topics. We still have a bit of a shoestring budget, but we're growing. And to me, I think the lesson that I have learned over that time is that the true power of journalism is in its ability to be objective, to be credible, and to be relentless in the pursuit of the facts. And that's what we try to do. And I think when I think about the work that Sentient does, like the topics that we cover, factory farming's impact on climate, on rural communities, on water, on animals, like it is so clear there is a problem with the food system. Otherwise, we wouldn't exist, right? And I think that this is the kind of interesting area. I don't think that we need to be neutral about that. We don't need to be neutral about the fact there are issues with our food system, but we do need to be objective in the way that we report on it. That's the area that Sentient is filling. And the way that I look at it is we're really helping people navigate the world around them, and where that line is for us, like, we cannot tell people what to think. That is not our job, but we can tell people what to think about. And I think that's like the important difference, and that's where our work, that's the bucket that our work is sitting in. And I think that when you do that well, when you have credible reporting and it's in the hands of lawmakers, of policy influencers, other journalists, that's when you start to see power and transition and change. And we have to work incredibly hard to uphold that standard. And I think we have three kind of key areas that we focus on really hard to make sure that everything we do holds up under scrutiny. And they're kind of behind the scenes. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share what those things are with you all, because I think they really define that line between advocacy and journalism. So for us, everything we do has to be transparent. So that's our funding, our editorial policies, our corrections policies. We're members of the Institute for Nonprofit News, so that means that everything we do has to be visible. They typically reject like 50% of applicants because they're so rigorous with who they allow in. Through that, we're now in the Rural News Network. Like, everything just has to be visible, otherwise somebody could say, oh, well, you're doing this, you've got an agenda, blah, blah, blah. No, you can't say that about Sentient. We are, like, everything is out there for you to see. The other thing is the editorial firewall. So we have an amazing editor-in-chief, Jenny Splitter, who's not here, unfortunately, but she is responsible for editorial. She does not have to do fundraising. That's my area. And I don't try and influence what she does in the editorial department. And we have a clause in all of our grant agreements. By funding Sentient, it doesn't mean you can say what we cover or how we cover things. That is so, so important. And the third thing is fact-checking. Like, if we don't have robust fact-checking, then everything will crumble. So we have a full-time fact-checker. Everyone is trained in fact-checking. Every piece we write goes through a fact-checker, goes through 2 editors. If it has a legal component, our legal counsel, Denise, who is sat down here, she checks it off for us as well. Like, we are so careful and so rigorous in all of these steps to make sure that everything we're doing is there and is robust and usable by people like you all. And that's kind of, that's where we sit in that ecosystem, and that's why we're so strict on that line between advocacy and journalism.
Okay, great, thank you. Kenny, I'll repeat the question. Can you give a brief overview of your path and your story related to advocacy and journalism?
Yeah, I took a really kind of unorthodox path to journalism. I started in nonprofits from 2010 to 2020. I worked at Mercy for Animals, Humane Society of the US, now Humane World for Animals, then went back to Mercy for Animals. And throughout that time, I worked on campaigns like Meatless Monday. I fought against state ag-gag bills, which were the bills that tried to make it essentially illegal to investigate factory farms. And then towards the end of my career, I started doing more communications work. Through that, I did a lot of opinion writing, also some kind of traditional reporting in journalism. And that led me to Vox when in 2020 they were hiring someone to start working with freelancers in an editorial role. So jumped on the opportunity. I think over time in advocacy, I had just been more and more interested and attracted to journalism, but I was like, I didn't know how to make the switch because I worried that I would maybe be perceived as too much of an advocate, too biased. But what I like about journalism is that, like, every journalist has their biases, their opinions. There's no really truly neutral story. You know, a lot of times when journalists write about these issues, they leave out animal welfare, which in my opinion is a form of bias. But what I really like at Vox, working with Marina and other people, is that like, we can have an opinion, we can have a take, an analysis of a situation, but to earn and keep readers' trust, we have to make sure that we do everything we can to check for that bias. So it's talking to people we disagree with, trying to talk to industry, the people we're critical of, trying to, I guess, really try to like steelman our arguments and kind of bring out the best arguments against our own ideas to make sure we're not like cherry picking or leaving out really critical information. So it's been like an interesting and sometimes challenging journey to go from advocacy to journalism. But I really like working at Vox, where I can still have an opinion and a perspective, but still practice in kind of conventional journalism norms.
Great.
Yeah.
Marina, how are you?
Thank you, Chris, for having us here. Can I just say I love animal law and animal lawyers, and I love when we can think about animal law in our stories, and I just think animal lawyers are some of the coolest and smartest, most interesting and creative people in the movement. So when you asked us to speak here, I was like, what do I have to offer this audience? But I will do my best. So to my personal path in advocacy and journalism, factory farming and animal rights is an issue that has been of like almost lifelong importance to me. Pretty much for as long as I've been old enough to think deeply about anything, I've been really devoted to it, and I feel like most of my life has been spent trying to understand why the rest of the world doesn't feel the same way. I'm sure many people in this room can relate. And so when I was in college, I tried out different ways of enacting this interest in my life. I tried out direct advocacy for a bit. I worked on a big cage-free egg campaign at my school, which was successful, by the way. And for a while, all of my peers knew me as the cage-free eggs girl. Shout out to Dave, Combe, and Heidi, who knew me when I was an embarrassing college student. And it was an incredible learning experience, and I also, part of why it was an incredible learning experience was I learned that it really was not for me. I'm not a natural organizer or activist at all, and I just really want to sit and think and read and write about ideas. And so simultaneously, I had been getting involved in my college paper and opinion writing. And that led me to spend my entire career in journalism. And for most of that time, these two things, like animal rights and journalism, were completely separate parts of my life. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that, including that it's just hard to have opportunities to write about factory farming in media, period. And also, I think I was scared that having to, making it the subject of my work, thinking about factory farming every day for a living would make me miserable and ruin my life, which it has not done. And so all of that changed about 4 years ago. I was living in Madison, Wisconsin, where I still live now, and I heard about this guy, Matt Johnson, with Direct Action Everywhere, who was about to face trial in Iowa. And facing many years in prison for an investigation he did into infernal horrors in the pork industry there. And I thought, well, wait a second, I live within driving distance of Iowa, so what could I possibly be covering that's more important than this, right? And so I covered it. I wrote about it for The Guardian, and I found that experience, I think of it as kind of like my gateway story. And I found, getting to write about, give expression to what activists are doing when they do open rescues and when they, break unjust laws. I found it incredibly exhilarating, and it kind of just naturally progressed and snowballed from there, and I kept writing about factory farming and animal rights, and it became my way of contributing to animal rights that I feel like I'm much, much better suited to than traditional advocacy.
Great. Jan.
I also would like to praise animal lawyers. So I actually don't have a background in advocacy. I have always been interested in animal issues, and I have a background in journalism, but I started my journalistic career into the economic crisis of 2008. So I turned to academia, which is what you do when you don't know what you want to do with yourself. And I quickly found that in academia, there were actually a lot of, in the academic parlance, there were so many gaps in the literature when it came to animal issues. Right? So you sort of had some animal ethics work, like normative ethics, but there was just this dearth of work, especially in what I do, which is political economy and policy research. And then having done that, and sort of as I was finishing my PhD, I realized that there was actually this, this translation gap between what was being done in academia, which by then was becoming more robust, and what was getting out to the public, right? Because a lot of well, now it has changed, right? But if you're talking late 20-teens, there were no people who were doing the animal beat or even the ag beat at major papers, there was stuff being written about in academia that was getting covered poorly. The people writing about food and food policy were food writers, right? They weren't policy experts. They certainly had huge blind spots around animal issues. And so I came to this out of academia, just trying to basically pitch op-eds and pitch articles, trying to do translation work. And I still see that as my role in this, which is translating academic work as, I suppose, an expert for a popular audience, which is something that, I mean, until the emergence of Sentient, until the emergence of Future Perfect at Vox, there was no real home for that in American mainstream journalism.
Great. So Anna, how does Sentient kind of navigate the line between advocacy and journalism?
Well, I think I kind of covered that in my first answer. I think that, like, for us, it's very interesting hearing and talking about all the journeys that people have went on. I realized I kind of didn't really mention that, but I also don't come from an advocacy background. I come from a media background, and I come from digital media and social media and videos and all of that kind of thing. And bringing that into this space and seeing, you know, the embrace of the animal movement and seeing, you know, how Sentient was originally kind of viewed as an animal advocacy like newsroom, and then helping that transition into a space like Kenny, your journey of going from, you know, Mercy for Animals to journalism and all of this. There are so many nuances and so many issues within that you have to confront on a daily basis, because just by talking about factory farming, people think you're an advocate. We do so many collaborations with other newsrooms, and when we start a call, myself and our editor-in-chief will be sitting there chilling, and we will just let the other journalists discuss what they eat and justify what they eat for like the first half hour of the call. We don't say a word. We don't say if we're vegan or anything like that. It doesn't matter. We just know that when that first call happens with whatever newsroom, that's going to be the conversation for at least half an hour, which is wild. But, you know, they've got to get it out of their system. And we sit there and go, okay, are we done? Can we talk about journalism now? Great. Like, that's just how it goes. And I think that, like, again, that's why we're so strict on all of these policies and all of these rules and all of this, like, rigorous processes that we have. Because if we don't, like, we're like, you know, like with Future Perfect, we're like the first newsrooms, you know, paving this way in this way. And that's not to undo the work of like so many great journalists. You know, we're in Chicago. It'd be remiss to not mention, you know, Upton Sinclair and like all of the great people who have reported on these issues over the years. But to be bringing it into mainstream conversation like anything niche is such a challenge. And you have to be like double rigorous, I guess, would be, you know, the kind of way that we think about it.
So Kenny, what are some of the recurring challenges you face covering animal agriculture?
There are a lot, and I definitely encourage anyone on the stage to chime in.
Long list.
Yeah, there's a long list. I'll just share a couple that come to mind immediately. The first, and this is something I think we have a lot of challenges with, is like I'll start out working on a story, and we're like, let's do 1,000 words. Then it turns into 1,600 words, 1,800 words, because I feel like I have to constantly explain the basics of animal agriculture. And I think maybe one of the problems we see in a lot of news media is that a story about animal agriculture doesn't really get into the specifics or the context. And so, but I feel like the reader needs to have that context, needs to understand if you're talking about water pollution, you have to understand that agriculture much of it is exempt from the Clean Water Act. Things like that. So I often find myself kind of figuring out how do I explain basic concepts of factory farming in a new way in every article. So that is a challenge, is that articles often end up becoming longer than I'd like because of that. And the second is just, you know, access. Like, I've been working on these issues for a really long time, and I've never been inside a factory farm. I've only been on kind of smaller, quaint farms, which are okay with letting people like me on. But I mean, even just a couple weeks ago, someone high up at a fish farm was just like, we're not gonna let you come and see our facility because you're critical of our industry. And to me, that's a real sign. Like, you hear industry often say, we are so proud of what we do. We are the original stewards of the environment. We love our animals more than anyone else. Then like, let people like me, let critics come and see it for themselves, but they never do. So I think that practical access of getting to experience and see what I write about is a real challenge. But then secondarily, a lot of times these companies don't even want to talk on the phone. They'll either say no comment or send us your questions over email. I send them like 8 very detailed questions over email. They don't respond to any of them directly. So then I have to follow up and say, hey, you didn't really respond to any of these. Can you be more specific? And then they just ghost me. So to me, that often ends up being part of the story. Like their silence is a part of the story to me.
Sure. And it's notable when you say in there like, oh, we reached out to so-and-so and they had no comment. It's like,
yeah, I've written like so-and-so did not respond to a request for comment like 500 times.
Yeah.
Any other things people would want to share? I'll just stop with those two.
Well, I'm always pushing Kenny to write shorter pieces, but don't hold myself to those standards whatsoever whenever I write.
It's funny. Well, Marina, how do you think about objectivity in the line between advocacy and journalism? And this is something that Anna touched on, do you think that journalists need to be objective covering these issues?
Yeah, so, okay, this is my spiel on this. I think about factory farming, animal experimentation, animal exploitation, and all of those questions from an animal rights perspective. And I have no compunctions whatsoever about that, and I don't think any writer should apologize for it. And I don't think it, I don't think it makes me any more inherently biased than someone who, who eats animals and has never, questioned that default way of seeing the world. And so, of course, I'm biased. I have, tendencies to interpret things in certain ways, like everyone does, and it would be totally unintelligible to try to talk about someone without bias, right? And I think that part of what we're doing is saying to readers, hey, you're biased too, and we want you to think about that. And I think that, the reason that Kenny and I are even able to do that, approach things the way they do, is because of the particular structure of media employment and news consumption that we have the opportunity to work in right now. And I think that, like journalists do different things depending on the genres and forms and norms that are available to them. I don't think there's like a single thing that it means to be objective and fair, like a single static thing that means universally. So all of that being said, sometimes, people will call me an advocate sometimes, and I kind of chafe against that term. We talk about there being a line between advocacy and journalism, and that wouldn't even be something that wouldn't even be a question that comes up for someone who we might think of as like a really like a traditional down the middle, like mid-century reporter. And then for people like Kenny and I and all of us, we are able to do our work with a point of view, and so that comes with, and that's a great thing. And being able to be value-driven and judgment-driven comes with a different set of responsibilities. Like it is really important to us we have to be independent from any of the organizations that we're writing about. We can be like all of us, we have been saying, we can be open about our values, about what we want the world to look like, about the things that are good and are bad. But we have to be, and that may be, like that worldview may be totally consistent with the things that people in this room advocate for a living. But we can't, we can't think of ourselves as being in concert with advocates when we write about them, or in concert with any particular nonprofit when we write about them, because we have to be able to make, our responsibility is to readers and to the truth, whatever that might mean, and we have to be able to make independent judgments about whether a particular advocacy approach is a good one, for example. And that also means not being, having boundaries and being at a distance from like the individual people who we might be writing about or might be involved in something that we're writing about, which is really hard to do because, I like all of you and we're fellow travelers and it's easy to get close to people in the course of doing this work, I think. And we also, like setting aside however I might feel about what might be the worst corporations in the world, we have to, like Kenny was saying, part of the job is to give them a fair shake, reach out to them, try to inhabit their perspective in a way that we wouldn't be doing if we were doing straight activism. And we also have different standards of evidence for making claims and making implications than we would if we were doing straight activism. And none of this means that we have to see the industry's perspective as just as meritorious than any other. And I think part of what it means to decide what it means for you to be fair as a journalist and what you're contributing to the conversation as a journalist is to be clear in your mind about which sets of ideas you're going to be generous to. And I think you also have to understand where normal people are coming from too, like normal readers who may have never thought about factory farming in their lives. And that means like writing about the issue in a calm, dignified style and not sounding screechy, and kind of letting the facts speak for themselves. So I think it can be an odd balance. I would say that like veganism is incredibly important to me personally as an identity, as a kind of community, and of course that has everything to do with my work, but also I also have to keep like personal and professional brains separate, and I think that enriches both things.
Great. So Jan, you talked a little bit about how you feel it's your niche to kind of bridge the gap between popular media and academic work. How do you think that we can collectively get better at that? And why do you think it is that the popular media so often kind of gets the science and social science wrong?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And look, I think that there are different incentive structures on different sides of the gap. I think in academia there are incentive structures that just say, do your research, publish in peer-reviewed publications, and then move on, right? And the idea is that if it's something that's of social import, that it'll get sort of picked up, right? There's this idea that the baton gets sort of organically passed to journalists. And that's quite simply not the case, right? Like you could write a brilliant study on whatever, water eutrophication in Iowa caused by factory farming and corn and soy monocropping for animal feed. But if that doesn't get into the mainstream media, it doesn't go anywhere, right? Like it doesn't get in front of the public, it doesn't get in front of policymakers, it doesn't get in front of advocates. But very often that bridge, that assumed bridge just doesn't exist, right? Or great studies have great press releases written about them and then just don't get picked up. And then on the other side of this, as I said before, and a lot of, we could talk about the general problems of media and the sort of neoliberalization, cutting of media resources, which is part of the story, but a lot of media just don't have issue area experts, especially around ag and animal issues on these beats, right? So I don't want to throw anyone under the bus by name, but if you just think about your media consumption about animal issues, for instance, a certain New York Times piece about DXC in Sonoma recently, or widespread coverage of the Chinese soy tariffs right now, you'll see that the people writing these stories miss basic things, right? The New York Times didn't write about the Reichard duck case. So much coverage of soy, other than, to give myself and Marina kudos, other than our recent pieces, literally doesn't mention what American soy sold to China does. The clause, which is fed to pigs on factory farms, does not appear, right? And it doesn't appear because the journalists aren't issue experts, or maybe there's an inherent bias, and I have some thoughts about that too. And so I basically saw my work, especially coming out of grad school, as just pitching op-eds and pitching stories, because there's no one that I saw doing this work, right? And so I think the lesson from that is that if, for those of you who are in advocacy or in research or in law, is don't assume that whatever work you do, be it in academia or in legal scholarship or whatnot, is going to find its way out there. Like, you have to do the work to get it out there, to build relationships with journalists, build relationships with editors, email editors, email journalists, and it's all unpaid grunt work, or just pitch op-eds. Get out of your comfort zone and pitch stories, right? And so I am a big, big advocate for experts telling their stories to a general audience, even if it's not what you're trained in, even if it's outside your comfort zone, even if it's not institutionally rewarded. If you care about these issues and you're not working on the journalism side, get it out, because otherwise someone else may write about it, and they may write about it wrong, or they may tell the incomplete story.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, Jan, like, I totally agree with your comment about this, like, access to experts. We work really hard to try and make sure that our journalists know who different experts are. But I think when you're a journalist and you're reporting and you have to get a story out, of course you're going to default to the person that you know. So, like, building relationships, like, for everybody in this room, like, building relationships with reporters so they know, like, oh, hey, I'm going to go to Kaylin for something about, like, environmental water, like, letting them know that there is a more diverse pool of people and experts out there, and building those relationships, I would say, is just as effective, if not like more effective, than the op-ed approach for some people. Like, so then you're a source in those stories. I think that's a great point, Jan.
Yeah, that was really true when I was in an academic setting, where people just feel like, oh, you're in an academic setting, you're objective, and so they would reach out to us all the time on things like that. Yeah. And it's interesting what you said too, Jan. Like, Steve Wise was a mentor of mine for a couple of decades, and he talked about his path and how he started as a practitioner doing these sort of dog-eat death penalty cases. And he's like, those are really great for the families involved, but he could do 100 of those a year and not much would change larger. So he started writing law review articles in the academic sphere, and he's like, did several really great ones of those, but he's like, that's great for the 30 people that are reading them. And then he wrote Rattling the Cage, and it's poof, it just exploded. Like, all of a sudden, NPR and all these other places are talking about animal law. It was really like foundational. But yeah, Anna, who do you think is reading Sentient's coverage of factory farming issues, and what role do you see as journalism affecting social change?
I assume everybody in this room reads our coverage.
Twice a day.
Twice a day. Gold star to Chris. So yeah, like, when I first started at Sentient 6 years ago, almost 6 years ago, our coverage was solely read by animal advocates, which is great. But now we have a much more ideologically diverse audience, which I would say is like even better and part of the strategy and part of the goal. As I mentioned, we do a lot of collaborations and a lot of partnerships. So our work is republished and shared in all different spaces to meet people, you know, where they're at, rather than just on our website. So as a quick example, like last year, we had about 3 million visitors to sentientmedia.org, mainly Chris.
Times a day.
Like, that's great, but because of our model of like republications, like we're on, you know, public radio, national media, like local media, international partnerships, we were republished and cited over 6,000 times. And that reaches, you know, like Wall Street Journal or like your local like Iowa newspaper. And through that, we reached about 50 million readers and listeners. And we see that those, like, what bracket those people fall into is kind of like 4 different buckets. We have lawmakers and policy influencers. We have journalists and content creators. We're seeing the movement leaders, like in the animal space, in the clean water space. Those people are using our work too. And we're seeing a lot of frontline communities. So a lot of people who are living with the effects of factory farming right now. And each of those different groups uses the work in different ways. And that's like how we know who it is that's engaging with the content and who we know that we have to tell stories for. And to me, like, I think that journalism is really the start. I mean, I would say this, I guess, but like to me, I think that journalism is really the start of the narrative and cultural change that I think all of us and probably everybody in this room is hoping to see. Factory farming is one of the most underreported and damaging systems on this planet, like from hollowing out all of the rural communities to the suffering of, all of the like land and aquatic animals to like clean water to everything. It touches everything, and we do not talk about it. And I think, there was a percentage, Washington Post reported that 74% of people think that reducing meat consumption will have little or no effect on climate change. And it's like, okay, well, the opposite is actually true. Like, it's wild to me that people don't even have that step of just a little bit of reduction. Like, forget about, veganism. And to me, that's like, I feel like we can't fully blame people because we know that the meat industry has spent like billions of dollars and decades on shaping the current narrative that we're all consuming. They're funding misinformation campaigns. They're buying up local newsrooms. And some of these like misinformation campaigns, they're targeted at farmers and at the farm workers themselves as well. And that's something that often kind of flies under the radar. But Sentient was the victim of one because we do a lot of reporting in local communities. And there's this ag industry aligned scientist who built like an education series, and he did a media module, and he decided that Sentient was the head of the anti-livestock media cartel, which is such a better job title for me. I'm like into it, but he also said that Sentient controls, they had a diagram, you've seen it, like Sentient controls Greenpeace, we control The Guardian, and you said that Marina was Kenny's boss, but actually I'm both of their bosses. Because apparently Sentient controls Vox as well. It's hilarious. We'd spent like $1.5 million in 3 years at that point. Anyway, and it is like...
It shows that you're having an impact though if they're that scared of you, right?
It is good, yeah, we are having an impact and it is good, but it's also really disconcerting because those farmers in those communities are the people that we're serving, those like meat processors. We want them to know that we're a legitimate outlet that they can trust. And they're being told to like toe the industry line, like the Pork Producers Council, the Farm Bureau, like they're saying, fight Prop 12, whereas actually the people that we spoke to were like, actually we want Prop 12. It doesn't affect the bottom line and the pigs are happier. Great. Like it's really disturbing. But to me, I think that's where the kind of the crux of it is. Like that's where the power of journalism is. Like when you have credible reporting in the hands of the right people, from like lawmakers to these frontline communities, it can embolden action, and those people can use that to create these like pathways to policy change and like agitate for the stuff they want to see. So kind of to surmise, I think that like journalism is really what creates the conditions for the change that I think we all want to see by just making sure that the truth is visible, it's verifiable, and very importantly, it's in the hands of all of those people who can actually enact and create the change that we want to see.
Yeah, well, on the statistics, just to clarify, like give another context, I think the Washington Post did a study that found, I think it was like 7% of American adults believe that chocolate milk came from brown cows. So like, whatever we may think in here, out in the wild, it's a bit of a different story. And when Kenny and I were working on the ag stuff back in like 2014 or 15, when the Idaho ag law was passed, some of the what they were saying on the floor of the legislature there were like, these animal advocates are these descending marauders coming in, invading our space. And I imagine Kenny in this like huge Viking helmet and like sword coming in, it's just like pretty funny contrast. But so Kenny, how do you think that like animal agriculture issues should be covered differently?
Well, this is also a question that like there's a lot to say, and if folks want to chime in, please do. But
you got like 2 hours. It's great.
Like our cartel boss just said, it's a very severely
overlord,
very severely like underrepresented industry in the news. Like if you read the news every day, you'd have no idea about factory farming or vivisection or puppy mills. Or in the rare instance you did come across a story about them, it probably leaves out a lot of critical issues or maybe kind of downplays the suffering of animals. So I think that's the first problem is just severe undercoverage given the scale of the problem. It's the biggest sources of animal suffering. And then secondly, I would just like journalists to be more critical. This is something I was talking about with Jan and Marina last night, is just the ag industry is treated not like other industries, but some kind of cottage network of tiny farmers who should not be criticized. But that kind of, not always, obviously there's lots of great animal coverage over the years, but for every like one good piece, there's a lot of pieces that never ask, well, how are the animals kept? What are the pollution records from this farm? How are the workers treated? And this kind of came up for me last night as I should have been trying to fall asleep. I was reading the news at like 10 p.m. or 11 p.m. And this is unrelated to factory farming. This is a zoo. But just as an example, there was this really long story in the New York Times yesterday. It was a top story about a small zoo in Watertown, New York. I don't know anything about this new zoo. I'm not going to pretend to know much. But the framing of the story was basically like, this was a bad roadside zoo. Now it's a good AZA accredited zoo. And it's financially struggling, and the town is trying to band together to like bring it back. And it really painted it as more of like a sanctuary because it had a lot of like quote unquote misfit animals who other zoos wouldn't take. And so I didn't have, it was like late at night, I didn't have the time to like really look up much about the zoo other than I went to USDA's animal care inspection records tool, and I found a lot of critical and non-critical inspection records, and there wasn't a single sentence or paragraph. And it could have taken the journalists literally 5 minutes to look up USDA inspection records. It could be that they're just not an issue expert, so they don't even know that the USDA has this inspection database. But it was clearly a pretty in-depth story that a lot of time was spent on it. And maybe there's a lot of positive things that could be said about this institution that they were writing about, but there wasn't a single like negative word other than it's like kind of checkered past. So I would just like to see kind of industries that use animals to be written about as skeptically and critically as, say, you know, oil and gas or like big pharma or other industries that we think about as having a lot of mismanagement or like inherent problems in their structures. Anything else people would want to add? How they would want to see animal ag covered differently?
I mean, I think I'd just like to echo that I'd like to see it covered,
Yeah.
which is what I think all of us want to do. I think it's just not, I mean, look, meat production covers an area the size of North and South America combined. It's the biggest user of water. It's the biggest contributor of methane from food. It's so making it the biggest contributor to climate change out of the entire food system. It's the scale of the problem is just absolutely not represented in coverage, period.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think I'd like to see that. And I think this also speaks to inherent bias, right? Like the omnipresence, the ubiquity of meat, the ubiquity of animal testing for that matter, so we're not only talking about factory farming, is the orthodox position, right? So I think the bias of a lot of journalists is to either accept it and then not write about it, or when they write about it, take a very sort of kid glove approach, right? Which is treating farmers as something other than just business people, which they are, right? Or starting with these sort of like glib things like, well, of course I'm not a vegan, or of course we would never talk about taking meat off anyone's plate, and yet here are some critiques, right? And I think that's where the bias is, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And so I think there's an inherent pressure to not be too heterodox, right? Like, why are we not asking the opposite question, right? Which is why do people who eat meat, why are they allowed to write about agriculture? Is that not an inherent bias?
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? But that question, and I'm not saying that they shouldn't be allowed to, but I'm saying that we should at least be asking that question.
Yeah.
Right?
And if so, there's a very good chance that they don't want to dig deeper into questions that will have to make them question their own habits and conduct, for sure.
I don't know if that's like entirely true though, because I think with like oil and gas coverage, like you will speak to journalists who are covering the oil and gas space and they're still like engaging with the oil and gas space. Do you know what I mean? Like they're flying to places, they're not using e-cars. Like
Sure. I think everyone does that though. It's like like as you're saying, you have these calls and they feel the need to tell you for half an hour why they eat meat and justify it. So I think there's a justification aspect that's pretty much, that's a little bit heavier with diet than sort of like electricity or something.
It's just like the counterculture, right? Sure. Like it's that thing of like, well, we're going against the grain, so we have to like justify. And as you said, it's not part of people's thinking. It's not part of their like normal conversation. And that's why it is so difficult to get journalists to cover factory farming as an extractive industry like oil and gas. It's just going to take a lot of work.
Yeah, another thing.
Sorry.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think there's this really interesting way in which there's a lack of understanding of the way that animal agriculture is important and also how it's not important. And by that I mean that it's not, animal agriculture and all of agriculture is not actually economically important in the US or any other, any wealthy country. All of agriculture is less than 1% of our economy. Animal agriculture is even less. And there are things that are downstream of the economy, like restaurants, retail, and so on. But we would still be eating food if we, which is to say, none of those things would be impacted were we eating less meat. So it's not economically important, and yet you get the impression when agriculture is covered in media, you get the impression that it's the most economically important thing ever. And there is nuance to that. In that it's more, it's more important in farm states and certain local economies. You get the wrong impression that it's more economically important than it is, and then the ways in which it is important are mostly ignored. Like its massive impacts on land use, the climate, on tens of billions of animals. So there's this interesting inversion that happens, and I think this is something we do well at Future Perfect, because our whole deal is like trying to see the world clearly, and you would think that that's like what all journalism is for, but I think that we have an ethic of trying to see the world clearly and be serious about what matters and what doesn't, and understanding scale.
Yeah, it's a really good point too. And you hear about like farm labor and farmers, and I think it's like less than it's like 1.5% of Americans are actually somehow engaged in agriculture, and that is trucking and the whole bit. When you cut everything in, it's a very, very small number. Yeah, I mean, that's something that really just, I remember Lewis Bollard was speaking at a school, and he had a stat, it was like Americans spend something like $27 billion on chicken each year. And I pointed out that Americans spend like $36 billion just on veterinary care for their cats and dogs. And it just, he just could not reconcile those. It just, think of ag being so much of a bigger economic thing than that. But yeah, question for you, Marina. What kind of animal agriculture or animal exploitation stories as an editor do you find actually perform the best?
Yeah, so I think the core challenge we face is that people don't want to read about animal torture, and they especially don't want to read about animal torture that they are implicated in. And we have even our professional copy editors and fact checkers who have to read everything that we write say that it's hard for them emotionally to get through stuff and has an impact on them. And before I started this job, I didn't have access to the back end analytics of which stories are doing well and which aren't. And I think I kind of just assumed, well, if a lot of people are interested in my piece on Twitter, that means it's doing well. And unfortunately, that's really not true. Twitter is not really a good indicator of how well a story is doing in most cases. It's more, it tells you about what a really niche slice of people who are passionate about the issue already are seeing, but not so much about our broader audience. So what kinds of stories do well? I think the first thing to say about that is it can be incredibly random and unpredictable. I wrote this piece, last year we had this big package that called How Factory Farming Ends, on the movement against factory farming. Jan wrote for it, and Kenny wrote for it, and I wrote this piece for it called Humanity is Failing One of Its Greatest Moral Tests. And I thought of it as, it was kind of just like all of my thoughts about the movement, and I thought it was insidery. I thought it would appeal to the same niche slice of people, and I didn't think it would do well, like traffic-wise. I didn't think a lot of people would read it, but actually a lot of people read it. And so the more that I'm in, I feel like the more I'm in this business, the less I understand about what's going to do well, which is like it's a really great thing in a way, because we don't want to be predictable and formulaic, and we want to surprise readers and be surprised ourselves. And that being said, I think there are some general principles that aren't particularly surprising about what does well. So you have to connect animal stories to things that people are already thinking about and want to be thinking about. Things like the protein craze, ultra-processed foods, the soybean trade war, which was really had a moment in the news. Also this new, this viral story about plant-based protein powders being high in lead, supposedly.
Mom sent that one to me immediately, for sure.
So connecting those kinds of things to the meat industry in a smart and critical way. I think Kenny and Jan have really good instincts about this. One story by Kenny I'm always mentioning as an example is this piece we did about the story behind your Super Bowl wings, and it's kind of like a sneaky way of getting a story about the history of the chicken factory farm industry in front of people during Super Bowl season. Thanksgiving is also a good opportunity to do this. And Kenny had this story about the horror behind Fairlife milk a couple of months ago, which is a Coca-Cola-owned milk brand that has become astonishingly popular really quickly in the last decade because of the protein craze. And so this is like your classic, in some ways it was kind of like a classic animal torture story, but we did it, the way we packaged it, it didn't really make it obvious what the piece was going to be about. So the headline was the terrifying reality behind America's fastest growing milk brand, and the lead photo was kind of like this abstract, kind of like an ominous looking photo of milk spilling out of a glass, but in a way that is not clear that animal cruelty is the main subject of this. It really captured a lot of readers' curiosity, because Fairlife is just something that people are buying. It's in the public consciousness, and it's this object of fascination. So that worked really well for us. And I don't want to, I think I've already made this clear, but I don't want to make it sound like we have to be formulaic or just chase trends, in what we do, because that's, it's not the case. And I think that a really important part of the job is to trust your instincts, and know a good story when you see one, and kind of lead and tell readers why they should care about something that they don't already know that they care about. I had a good example of this actually is a story I had when there was a brief period when I was freelancing, and before I started at Vox, and there was this story I had been pitching. I pitched so many times, I think to 17 places, about the veterinary profession, the veterinary profession's support for factory farming, and the veterinarians who are, who are fighting what they call the corporate capture of their profession. And I was kind of baffled that it was so hard to place. I never placed it successfully as a freelancer, even though I thought it was an evocative and good story that would connect with people. And then, so ultimately, I started working at Vox 3 years ago and published it there, and it did really, really well. And I think that's a good example of how stories can do well. Editors, and editors aren't always right about what's going to do well. And I think that I guess the last thing to say about this is I think like having a story that's just good and well written is really important and helps it do well, I think. And I'm incredibly passionate about good writing, and I think that it can be hard to talk about because it's so intuition-based and case by case, but I think the way that often works for me in my process is that everything I write, I need, in order for me to be satisfied with it, I need it to be interesting to me personally, not just to the lowest common denominator reader. I need for myself to feel like I am making insights that I think are interesting to me that I didn't know before, and that are genuinely adding something novel to the conversation, and that can take extra time to do for sure, because you really have to think about what's the most analytically what is the most analytically interesting thing that I can say here, and I think that it really pays off and is more worthwhile than chasing the headlines.
Great. So Jan, you kind of cover a lot of different territory, and so how do you kind of, when you're dealing with sort of ethical issues, scientific issues, social science, how do you kind of parse that out when sometimes they can actually pull in different directions?
Yeah, I think this comes down to this question of trying to tell the story that's as truthful as possible, and I think that there's a tendency among people in general when, for instance, making an argument about, let's say, factory farming, to use motivated reasoning to sort of gravitate towards things that reinforce their biases, right? So for instance, to say that, oh, well, a really strong argument against factory farming is that meat consumption is ultimately unhealthy, for instance. But actually, that's not what the science tells us, right? We have proof linking red meat, and especially processed red meat, to increase morbidity. We don't have the same thing for chicken or pork, right? And I think that you can make a strong argument about factory farming, whatever it is that you're saying about it, without sort of using motivated reasoning to suggest that every single bit of evidence points against that thing, right? It's similarly important to say that factory farms are important labor hubs, right? And that so if you're fighting against factory farming, you need to think about not just impact on labor of the operation of factory farms, but also alternatives for labor forces if factory farms were to go away. And I think if one were to very much be in an advocate mindset, one would try to skim past that, right? I'm not arguing for nuance for the sake of nuance, but I'm arguing for doing justice to claims, much as, for instance, one can say that if beef, for instance, is by far the highest emitting and the most impactful form of meat production, that yes, chicken is a less impactful environmentally form of meat production. Yeah. And that is a fact. One can then say that nonetheless, the impacts of chicken production are perhaps worse from a animal welfare standpoint. They're, especially at slaughterhouses because of line speeds, they're definitely worse for labor, and they also cause suffering to more animals. And both of those things are true, right? And I think that it's just incumbent, if you're trying to tell a good story, it's incumbent on you to try to tell that entire story.
So quick follow-up then. So how do you make sure you have the facts right in an area that's so rife with mis and disinformation?
Well, whoever's writing the story needs to get their fact. But I think there are two things here, right? One is the facts themselves. And this is, Vox, Sentient, The New Yorker, whoever have fact-checking teams. And I think for media consumers, I don't even know to what extent media consumers even think about this, but there's a vast gulf between, again, I don't want to throw anyone under the bus, but less reputable media organizations and reputable ones who fact-check. And so I think fact-checking is absolutely crucial. But the second part of this is not just getting the facts right, but including the necessary facts, right? Like you could write a story about the tariff war with China where everything is factually correct, but you haven't, for instance, told a basic story that The rise of meat consumption in China has led to the rise of domestic pork production and the rise of domestic animal feed production. So China's basically offshoring land use because they don't have land to grow soy, and that, in fact, the United States soy industry has grown in order to feed that demand in China. Now that that's closed, the Chinese government has going to Argentina and Brazil. There, the soy is leading to deforestation. Like, all of those things, I mean, I think should be included. But so what I'm saying is that there's both a question of factuality and a question of inclusion and omission.
Yeah.
And I think the best stories are the ones that include as much context for the reader as possible.
Hence Kenny's 1,800-word stories.
Yes, that's what I was thinking as Jan was saying all that. I'm like, those are all the same thought processes that go into a story. And I feel like it would be a disservice to leave some critical parts out just for brevity.
But I feel like it's also our job to like build relationships with those other newsrooms and those other journalists so that they even consider these like little facets of the conversation, because you're totally right. Like, these key points when it comes to welfare, et cetera, are completely missing in these stories. But I don't think it's like necessarily always for sinister reasons. It's just, it's not front of mind. And that I definitely, we work hard at that at Sentient, of building those relationships with journalists who we might not always agree with, but just to be like, hey, chickens suffer too. That's not controversial to say. And it's like, oh yeah, maybe I should include that. Yay. So yeah, I think you're totally right. And I think it's on us to help maintain and grow that conversation.
No, I also think for the audience, I mean, I sort of want to get, I'd like to hear if the audience has questions, right? Because in a sense, I'd like to provide information that's useful. But I mean, this is, if you're an expert, if you're a lawyer, or if you're an advocacy group, if you see a story that gets something wrong, you should, I mean, you could sort of angrily tweet about it or whatever, but which I recommend because it's cathartic. But you'd be surprised the extent to which there are editors out there who are open to a well-phrased, brief correction that just says, look, you drew a line from X to Z, but you didn't mention Y, and I, as an expert, think Y is really important. In the future, feel free to reach out to me, feel free to reach out to my organization. I'd love to talk to the journalist who wrote this. Just so you tell the whole story, That's a 4-line email, takes 5 minutes, and that may very well do what Anna's talking about, which is put you on the radar. So next time they're covering that, they'll say, oh, I remember when we missed Y, so let's call that person, let's call that organization, and let's get them into the story. And in fact, this is what industry groups are so amazingly good at, right? Industry front groups and industry groups are so good at getting themselves into stories, ensuring that they're on the record. Right? Like, think of the amount of times you've read a story about food that cites a critic, the industry, and then like the Center for Food Integrity or something, right? And it's like, how the hell did CFI get there? It's because they hound editors and they try to make themselves seem like an objective third-party source, but they get their voice into the story. And so then you have a story that will have sort of 2 pro-industry voices, one of which is ostensibly third-party, right? And so I think a lot of that sort of behind-the-scenes battle for space in stories is unseen by the public. And so, but I think a lot of editors are open to hearing from experts.
So we'd like to leave some time for questions from the audience, but while if anyone has a question, please come up to the microphone. While we're doing that, just a quick lightning round question. So this is something that, with this room, like what makes a legal issue interesting or compelling for journalists? So if someone of us has a really something we think is really hot, how do we get the journalists interested in writing about it?
Yeah, I think we cover a lot of policy issues. We've reported on the work of Seed, Farm Stand, Animal Partisan. We've done a lot of this type of story. So there are a lot of fun things that you can do to kind of pique our attention. I think I'll say very quickly, number one is, is there a character? We're in the storytelling business, so we want characters. Is Pete Paxton going to be there and tell us all of the insights and be charismatic and fun about it, and we can tell a really cool story? Or is there a local resident who is upset and will go on the record and share something? Having that story character is really important. The other one is, can it be nationally resonant? So we do a lot of locally relevant, nationally resonant stories. is there some kind of thing that can take it from something that's a local case that then permeates out? Like we're covering, avian flu data withheld by UC Davis. Like that's now being used by a law firm in a lawsuit, because avian flu is a national issue, right? So is there something that kind of pulls it out to a national level that's going to be getting interest there? And I think finally, like, is there something particularly like egregious or repetitive about some kind of violation? Like, is a factory farm doing something like 50 times and then getting a sweetheart deal? Or is it something that's been going on for a long time, like the water use, the Fondamonte farm we just reported on in Arizona? They're taking the water, all of the crops being grown, are going to Saudi Arabia to feed their cattle. This is an ongoing issue, but it's something that we'll report on because it's something that's still not regulated and still important. So those would be the kind of three things that I would look at.
Great. Well, we don't have a ton of time, so we'll jump to the first audience question here. Great, thank you.
Hello, Jill Fritz. I'm a Senior Director of Wildlife Protection for Humane World for Animals. And I just wanted to touch back and not push back or oppose, but just touch on what you said about the beef industry being the less environmentally impactful industry, and
most.
Something along those lines. Yeah, less impactful than say the large scale confinement operations, but. The beef industry and more largely the ranching industry and the beef and cattle are largely responsible for the eradication and the ongoing relentless persecution of our large carnivores, wolves and grizzly bears. And so I also wanted to touch on a question that you asked of the panelists earlier of what type of coverage would they like to see more. And I would just put out there, I would love to see more coverage of the ranching industry's persecution of large carnivores, because they're extremely important environmentally as well.
Kenny actually wrote a really wonderful article about wildlife services recently that was like really in depth and touched exactly on this issue that you're talking about.
Okay, yes, thank you.
Sure.
Hello, my name is Annabelle. I'm with the Lewis and Clark Student Animal Legal Defense Fund chapter. And something that came to mind when I was hearing all of you speak, there was a mention of a need to interpret like academic information and specialized information for like lay audiences, people who don't have like specialized areas really. And I think we're in a really interesting time with social media, short form content affecting everyone's attention span, and people are less media literate, I think, than they used to be. So I'm wondering, how do you reconcile the need to capture readers' attention with the need to convey information about what animals are going through, like fairly and ethically, because it's becoming harder and harder to do that, at least from what I've observed?
We do a lot of work in this, I'll just say very quickly. I think that you have to look at every platform for a different purpose. So when we're doing a story, like a long form investigation, what's on the website is different from then what goes on social media. So we had a story where we had footage, a guy had submitted a complaint to the EPA, and he had the footage of what looked like untreated animal waste going into an open drain in Iowa, and we released that footage. It was disgusting, but it got like 1 million views on TikTok and started sparking a conversation between local Iowans about this issue with this particular facility, and then people can go back to the article, or they can just have the conversation there. I think we have to understand that the way people interact with social media, with video, with long-form content, like it's completely different. Like our articles are probably more useful to journalists than they are to, people in these frontline communities who can then get the video and be like, hey, this is happening on our doorstep. Like, I think it's about diversifying the way that you share and present the content that you're making. But you're right, it's an ongoing challenge.
Kenny, do you remember the title of your wildlife services piece?
Oh, I don't, but if you Google like USDA Wildlife Services Vox, you'll find, I've done a couple stories on it. Another
it's
thing,
like the meat industry's war on wildlife.
There you go. The editor remembers the headline. I would say one thing I'd just add is that we spend a lot of time thinking about headlines because your question was kind of like, how do you write about this stuff truthfully, but not in too much of like, I don't know, a sensationalist way to catch attention on social media? It's tough because I think factory farming is inherently sensational in the sense that it is just massive and terrible. And how do you make every headline not seem like a red alarm fire while also capturing that horror? You don't want to be like the boy who cried wolf and every story is like the most important, terrible animal story ever. But we spend a lot of time thinking about headlines to make sure that they're balanced and accurate, but also really capture like the cruelty that we're covering.
I think we've got time for one more question.
Thank you.
Is Alana Braverman.
Hi, I'm Alana Braverman. I'm one of the co-founders of Greener by Default. Thank you all so much. This is really interesting. I hadn't really thought about that gap between people reading articles and being like, oh, they didn't cover this thing. Should I reach out? So I'm definitely going to start to do that. It seems like probably a full-time job for somebody to be reading everything that's coming out and thinking to do that. And I'm just curious, do any of you have staff on your teams that are doing that or reaching out to other organizations to ask them to make comments? Because I think it's really crucial.
We do reach out when we see that there's a missing piece of information around like animal welfare or whatever, and we'll speak to the journalist from like a peer-to-peer perspective, but not in like a corrections way necessarily, more just like, hey, have you thought about including this piece? But, you know, I think that Jan made a great point about experts actually reaching out and correcting. I mean, just one piece a day or something.
But it is effective. We've had that happen several times where we'll see something and we'll reach out. Because journalists, they want to get it right.
Yeah.
You know, it may just be that they missed something or they got it wrong. So they've been pretty responsive and able to get things corrected pretty quickly, I found.
I think I've done that maybe once or twice with some story, you know, there were a lot of stories about ventilation shutdown in the last couple years, which is something I know a lot about. And I think I've reached out to a couple of reporters when there were details that were off. But for the most part, no. I think that's an interesting idea, that we can actually engage with these like media colleagues who are writing stories about agriculture that are frustrating us.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm being too polite. I feel like it's not quite my place to like reach out to journalists. It would be a full-time job. And maybe I've done it here and there on social media, and I try to like, you know, be polite and kind and not like, you know, call people in rather than out. But I definitely encourage people to, like I've talked to environmentalists who write and think about factory farming, and they've definitely, like when I've been like, you should just reach out to journalists, and the thought never occurred to them. But I like getting feedback. Sometimes it's really helpful. I've updated stories because of it. Like Jan was saying, sometimes if people reach out with critiques, I'll reach out to them for their thoughts when I'm doing a related story a couple months later. So be nice, but be direct and clear, and don't make an email this long. And I think it could be appreciated.
Great. Well,
like being concise is actually important because I don't know what it is about this industry, but journalists are bombarded with emails, with like things they could be, with work and things they could possibly be thinking about all the time, and they're, if they're sent an email that's like a wall of text, I think like they literally will not read it.
Sure. That's right.
well, we are at time. My apologies. There's a virtual question that we weren't able to get to, but my apologies there. But please join me in thanking Anna, Kenny, Marina, and Jan for such a wonderful panel.